All right, let's get started. Committee Economic Development Committee meeting. Start. I'm John Weddleton, the chair.
Training someone.
Stephanie Mormello, Municipal Traffic Engineer.
Chris Judy, Office of Economic and Community Development.
Amanda Loder, Clerk's Office. Eric McConnell, Office of Economic and Community Development. Mandy Arnott, Clerk's Office.
Phil Steyer, GDH Electric.
Rob Burks, AK Slogan.
Lou Weaver.
AK Fulmer. Hugh Wade, Hockley, Electric.
Larry Duffy, attorney for Hugh Wade.
Rick Usher, RC Tenderbox.
Chris Usher, RC Tinderbox. Dana Levine, Council for RC Tinderbox.
Ryan Yell, current planning.
Francis McLaughlin, current planning.
Kathy Gleason, Bergen Community Council.
And Amy Nabosky on the phone. So we, the agenda has the two cases first, and then let's talk about pedestrian routes. So I didn't know if Jeff wanted to sit around for, I was gonna, not start that till 9:45.
Okay, that's fine.
And then you get a break, or you wanna hang out and talk with us?
No, I can leave
Okay,
myself
sorry
my
you
stuff
didn't
here.
get
No,
that
that's
message.
good.
We wanted to save you guys some time.
So 9:45?
Yeah, we won't start before then. Would that be
Great.
good?
I'll come back.
Mr. Chair, would it be possible to reorder the agenda to start with the discussion of pedestrian route?
Well, you know, we could, I wanted to make sure we got to the two marijuana cases, and they've been going pretty quick, 15, 20 minutes last meeting. And this issue on the pedestrian routes could take longer than this meeting, because it could get complicated.
Sharon and Sean are not present. You know. So the two planners assigned to the two cases are not here right now, and I'm not competent in the cases. I'm trying to read up on it right now. I apologize. They're not my cases.
Will they be coming then, or?
Well, Sharon's here and Sean is walking in the door, so right now, so I think he could handle the RC Tinderbox, and then I'll phone Sharon to the other case. I talked to her this morning about it.
The RC Tenderbox first?
Yeah. Okay.
Does anyone have trouble with that?
No, without that.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So we'll start with RC Tinderbox. So Sean, you wanna give us a?
Sure,
overview?
yeah. So it's over there off of King Street, in the industrial condo kind of area. And they have, in the application, or with their application, they have a letter from the traffic engineer, kind of waiving some of the requirements for parking. It's a pretty tight slot, and she felt that as long as marijuana, that was to change use, they'd have to come back. You know, they'll say this went away and went into something else, they'd have to come back to traffic engineer anyhow.
They're only cultivation, is that correct?
You're only cultivation, yep. So there won't be any.
Change the retail, it's gonna change the use.
Yeah.
No retail.
No
No
retail.
retail ever.
Yeah, thank you.
So that's, it's just gonna be cultivation related traffic.
Cultivation and manufacturing of goods, which is in front of us.
That'll come back. The closest protected land use, which we did have a comment about, was 850 feet away by pedestrian, route. It says it's at 7801 Spoon Street. I believe that's like a Korean church type, having a condo warehouse. So as a crow flies, it's a little bit shorter, but pedestrian walking distance is clear as the ball. And I think we just had, this Chugash Electric, they're updating the, upgrading to meet that. And we just have a few other small, striped parking area.
We did do that. That was I have issues. We
And
did
then,
do this right.
we did limit the maximum number of employees at any given time to 30 each.
Okay, and just we'll have someone give a report, and then we'll go around, so you guys, we'll give you a chance to talk and just kind of throw in whatever.
That's it for that case. Mine.
Mr. Trainee?
Phil Howard, where are we at? Because this King Street's kind of a lot of these going into there.
Yeah, an upgrade is necessary at this property. the property owner is responsible for that. And we've been in contact with that person. They know what they need to do, and they've got a rough estimate from us when they complete a work order and pay a deposit. We'll be able to provide a, more defined estimate, but that process is moving forward and everybody knows what they need to do. The paperwork has been sent to the property owner, and we're just waiting to receive it back to get things started.
Amy, any comments?
Yeah, I'm glad Phil was there. Power was a big talking point of discussion when we first started going through these processes to decide, because we saw what's happening in the lower 48. And, I personally have issues. If I have yet to see affirmative action on the property owner's part to actually get the process going and get the power in there, I think that becomes a problem until such time, and maybe Phil can help me here, but until such time I see a positive work order or affirmative action on the property owner's part. I mean, Phil, is this something that's only going to affect this property, or could we have a negative impact with some of the neighbors? I don't really know. I'm not an electric expert, but what happens if we start approving all these marijuana licenses that you've already identified have insufficient power?
As I understand the process, the requirement to do the power upgrade will be a condition of the special land use permit. And the applicant will not receive their special land use permit until they have complied with all of the conditions, including the requirement to upgrade power. So as these things come before the assembly, as I have watched, you have approved with conditions. And at that point, it's a handoff from the assembly back to the professional staff at the municipality to ensure all the conditions are complied with before the permit is issued. And therefore, I guess what I'm saying is, I don't think it needs to be a concern, because frankly, if people do not proceed to do the upgrade, they won't receive their special land use permit.
And the assembly, this is Erica, the assembly's approval will never be effectuated if they don't comply with the conditions. So while the assembly may say yes, as long as we do A, B, and C, if they never do B, the power upgrade, then we'll never hand them, we'll never sign off and hand them the copy of their permit to allow them to open.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to make sure we weren't letting anything slip through the cracks, because I was concerned. And I'll be interested to hear the applicant have their discussion with the committee here, because again, another one of the issues here is I want them to know up front that they're probably going to have a major problem with traffic too if they think they're going to tack on any sort of retail to this cultivation. It doesn't look like they are, but I just want them to know, up front, that could be a major factor for them. So I'll sit back and just listen. I'll put my phone on you and I'll listen.
Thank you. Sorry, Sean, so the conditions are maximum 13 employees?
Yes.
Where's that, why is that?
I think it has to deal with the parking. Let me take a look.
I can speak to that.
Okay, I want to get the list of conditions, then I'll just have you guys address it.
Page 2 out of 9, John.
Yeah, let's take a look at that, John.
Line 9, page 2. Maximum number of employees permitted on site at any given time is 13.
It's because of parking, that's what it's in the
Yeah.
packet.
So the traffic engineering department included a summary, and they've received from the municipal traffic engineer for parking reductions from 21 to 14 spaces, with the requirement that the maximum number of employees on a site at a given time is 13. This reduction was approved by the municipal traffic engineer on August 12th. So that's some comment that the municipal traffic engineer made, stipulation that they can only have 13 employees.
So, you guys can sit up front at the table if you want. You guys can you meet all the conditions and anything to add?
Right, it was just a parking agreement, that we reached with the city that's been reported, and we can't go over 13 employees, and then also the parking agreement that's reported, requires that we do not have any retail at this location, because there's just not enough parking. The parking that exists currently doesn't work for any use, so this building, without the parking agreement, without the city working with us, the building couldn't be used for anything. So that's why it is so important that that they can't tack on retail, because it won't, it won't work. So yes, we can meet all the conditions. Number 11, so is this the smell test that the DHHS was recommending? Okay, so that's fine, so just the four corners of the property and then keeping like a log? Is that okay? And is there gonna be, can we just make our own log up?
I think you can, but I do know that, the health department will have something for you if
They
you
will
want
have
to
something?
there.
Okay, great.
Any other comments on this one?
Can you, I just skipped over, well, I read it a few days ago, but can you remind me of, I saw there was 3 or 4 people that showed up at their community meeting, but were there any specific concerns? I just don't recall from this one. Were there specific concerns raised from the community? And if there were, how are they being addressed?
That was to you.
Oh.
Sorry.
No one showed up to our community council meeting. Actually, Mr. Trady was there.
A meeting where there was a sign-in sheet and there was like 3 or 4 names on it.
Right, there were.
Amy, this is Dick. I've attended all the community council meetings. They've showed up religiously. And that community council has no problem at all with this
Okay.
application. I
Okay.
don't miss them.
That's what just what I was asking. Like I said, I was trying to go off of my memory here, and I was remembering this particular one. I couldn't remember any specific community comments, so.
We may have to have them run for office, so that dependable showing up to community council meetings.
So I
Thanks,
had
Dick.
No problem.
one question. You had 2 owners or 3, because there's a third one on the lease and.
There's
so on.
3 owners.
There's 3. It's a little inconsistent in here at some point.
There's 3 owners, but Matthew is not as much in the operational part of this. It's really Chris and Rick running the operational.
He's the capital.
He's the he's the equity investor, and he also has, you know, his doctor, he has a medical background, and
Which is, he's seeing patients today, which is why he's not here, but I believe he'll be here tomorrow for the work session.
Okay. So any thoughts from the committee then?
Move to approve it.
Amy, you want to second that?
Yep, that's fine.
Okay, any opposition? Okay.
Do we get our conditions, excuse me, John, on the signs and everything? We're fine there?
Number 6.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure, John.
We're just, list of conditions is getting longer on all of these. So. Okay, well, thank you. I guess we see you tomorrow.
yes, thank you.
Farmer Jack, who's here?
Yes, I'm a staff for Farmer Jack's. I just left the room, I didn't see him, so I went to call. Are you? He's on his way apparently. Are you associated with Farmer Jack's?
No.
We're just
Okay. Okay, I see.
Ms. Karen, I think you could go ahead.
Okay. Farmer Jack's is located on King Street. It's in an industrial area. It had, the building it's in one unit, and there's several units in this building. The one unit that they have, that they are hoping to occupy, had been used as a vehicle repair garage, which they've renovated for marijuana cultivation. The district-specific standards of the I-1 district are met. The proposed facility is a unit in an existing 2-story building. It's surrounded mainly by other uses for vehicle repair and disassembly of appliances and other items for scrap metal reclamation. There's outdoor truck storage also surrounding the area. We did receive a letter from Chugach Electric saying that they did have sufficient power capacity at this location. In terms of what they still need to provide, they needed a site plan that shows the 5 parking spaces that are assigned for this particular unit. As I said, there are about 4 units in this one building, and they showed site plan with about 15 parking spaces, but we want to specify which of those are provided with this lease. So that's pretty simple. And then there's another comment from traffic, wanting some more information about two-way traffic flow as opposed to one-way traffic flow. So I think that those can be worked out. And they did have a community meeting, but no one attended. Although he does say that he received a phone call from someone, but no one attended the meeting.
Thank you. Any thoughts? Yeah.
No.
Amy?
I didn't see anything that jumped out on me on this one. This one is strictly cultivation, and they're not planning retail in the future, right?
As far as I know, they don't plan any retail.
They're not
I
planning
didn't
manufacturing.
Yeah, because this one's not in your, you don't have King Street in your community council.
Yes, I do.
Oh, you do. So this one, I didn't see any. It looks
They're
like-
calling it the Green Mile now.
It looks like they've been going to Campbell Community Council.
Chaco County Community Council.
Okay, no issues with the community council.
Not that I've seen from that community council.
Okay. Yeah, I was gonna say, I didn't see anything that jumped out at me on this one. So, I think, I don't have any questions on this one.
Okay, so any recommendations? Anybody else have comments? And he's not here, but I don't have questions for him.
Not here anyway, I don't think.
I can put him on the phone, I can call him.
I don't have questions.
I don't think we need
He's
it.
on
Actually,
the
there's a
board.
work session tomorrow, so.
Would you ask him to be at our work session tomorrow?
He will be.
Take him with you.
He might have to.
Just move to approve this one.
Okay, so we have a motion to approve it with the conditions. Amy?
There he is.
Yeah, I'll second it.
Ah,
Here, we'll let him.
Here he comes.
Here.
Sorry.
Farmer Jack, huh?
You're waiting for us?
No, we're moving on without you. Any objections? Hearing none. Okay, so we move to approve your application.
Oh, best speech I ever gave.
Just
Have you
want to
have
invite
any?
you to the work session tomorrow.
Okay, well, 9 or?
Well, but you can show up at 9.
You can come with us.
It wouldn't matter, I couldn't get my car started anyway.
Okay, so we've got those done, and I told him 9:45 for getting too fast. So, you want to call Stephanie and say, come on down? And just, Jenna, I have a question. So where did the, for cultivation is one spot per 1,000 square feet?
I think so, yes.
And where's that?
We didn't have any experience, so we based that on the general industrial use parking standard.
Okay. Might that be high?
Could be.
So
Yeah.
for yours, if you have 13, maximum 13 employees, is that way more than you need for your?
No, that's not way more, but I think it's the only way that we can make the building work and make traffic happy, but, it's like 14,000 square feet cultivation in Arizona, it's like 20 employees.
Oh, really?
Because they have to run each and every room and go in there and trim and blah, blah, blah. These guys are gonna make it work, because they're gonna be efficient and just kind of make it flow. It's really the only thing we can do, right? It's a 5-year lease, and didn't really expect the parking to be this, much of a big deal. But the issue is that the parking that exists, the building doesn't work for any use.
Right.
So you have to tear part of the building down to make more parking. So, we're gonna make it work. They're gonna make it work.
Just curious about, because we didn't know what to expect, so we made parking requirements, and maybe they're too high or too low, as people are looking at. But if you have 20 employees or 13, right, but they're not all at the same time, there's some working nights. What's the?
Right, so it's 13 employees per shift. Like they're at any, right, at any time, not just
Per
30.
shift. So you might be running 13 per shift.
Right, that's what so that's the max, it's 13 employees, and then what my number before, 20, that's per shift, right? I mean, these things are a little bit more intensive than you might expect, because when you scale up to this big of a size, there's all these mold issues, there's things you really have to control, and that's gonna be a learning process for a lot of these companies. But from my experience in Arizona, I mean, yeah, 14,000 square foot, 20 people are on and are working, you know,
John, one thing, tomorrow's work session's from 12:30 to 1 o'clock. 12:30 to 1 o'clock.
Mr. Vice Chair,
Yes, ma'am.
just FYI for the future, unless we have a problem with a marijuana application that comes before us, I'm not planning on attending the work sessions, just because I don't really think it's overkill. So, unless I have a problem, I'm not gonna attend tomorrow.
That's fine, Amy. We just have a meeting with the mayor. We have a work session from 11:30 to 12:30, reference the state of Alaska cut back to the MOA budget. So I
Oh, yeah,
anticipate a
I'm
lot
going
of
to that
people
one.
there.
Yeah, I'm going to that one. I just, for the marijuana licenses, personally, like I said, unless I have a problem with them, I won't go to the work session, just because I think we kind of hash it out.
I know.
And
I think the big thing is when we start to get retail in front of us, they've got a lot more time on
yeah,
retail.
no, I think you're probably right.
Sorry.
Terry, you had some thoughts on,
All I was going to say is that the traffic engineer has the ability to address potential reductions under these circumstances, but it all starts with a calculation based on square footage. So the notion that you end up at 13 is probably not then based on the square footage of the area, it's simply based on physical constraints
Right.
associated.
no, I understand in this case.
Okay.
I'm just thinking because we have some changes coming forward, and it's something to continue to look at. You want the parking requirements reasonable. I mean, maybe it should be by plant or something, it's just something to think for in the future. Since we have time to kill,
Yes, I think the manufacturing, is a little bit high, isn't it 350, 400 for one space, and manufacturing, that takes less people, I mean, just somebody running a machine.
Was it 400?
400 per space.
I also want to note that, that was zoned for that many spots back in when that building was built in 1982. And I'm pretty sure King Street's been widened since then. So,
Well, and that's why we got Stephanie was great with, like, helping making it work, since it didn't work for anything.
I think a square foot by canopy, the building is one thing, but the canopy is really what designates labor, right? So if you were to, if maybe in their case, they're not using all the square foot of the building, only a certain percentage of it is actually canopy requiring labor. So maybe you could more orient it towards expected labor square foot.
What is canopy?
The area that the plant's from, just like the south.
The part of it that's lit.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thanks. Hugh, you had a comment?
Oh, I just, from a commercial real estate perspective, this is just one use that is in this bigger thing of industrial, and the minute you start slicing and dicing these particular uses, parking, it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, that's
But
right.
this is exciting because we're talking about jobs, we're talking about increased rents and property value, so if it came to it, and you could actually squeeze more jobs in a space, because you were willing to tweak that, then that's pretty positive.
If I may, I'm not associated with any of these applicants.
You know us.
I'm just kind of curious, are there any other business types within the municipality where parking is limited by employee rather than the number of cars?
It has occasionally been a condition of an approval, when we have a situation like this where we're trying to facilitate the business, but there is a parking issue based usually on, it being an existing building and having been constructed before there were parking requirements in place. So it doesn't happen too often, but it has happened before.
Right. And the reason I ask, I for 20 years I've dealt with this kind of issue as an architect, and as we go forward and we learn more, we get a better handle on what the parking requirements are for this type of facility, taking into account, for example, that in many cases, half of the canopy is gonna be in darkness, during a given 12-hour cycle. You know, that's a huge factor that, I don't think it's really been discussed yet. It might be it might be better to limit it by the number of vehicles, since that's actually the problem, and give the business owner the opportunity to adjust their workforce accordingly. People might want to carpool, ride a motorcycle, ride a bicycle, walk to work, you know. There might be opportunity, my fear here is that we might be throttling commerce, where what we're really trying to do is control market. That, I throw that out for consideration.
Appreciate that. Good.
I think what we're doing is starting a new industry up, and maybe over the next year we'll have experience under our belt, I'm sure. We've actually been with us since we started this process. And I think we're approving the licenses as fast as we can, and we don't want to overburden them with parking. We want to make sure there's enough adequate parking. Because I can tell, there's one I know we can talk about later, but I can't believe he wants to operate on that street in that parking lot without being concerned about parking. Depends on the area. They're in a great spot on King Street.
And I assume
It's industrial.
Yeah, and I assume if we get to the point where it's not feasible for us to only have 13 employees, we can come back to Stephanie and maybe.
Well, here, these are all coming back up for evaluation anyway.
Yeah.
Every year.
Yeah.
Is the city gonna do that, coinciding with the state does it this June, right? Every year in June? We have to renew? Yeah, we should have a date for this.
Okay, well, I think we can move on to the pedestrian routes, and I'd say anyone really deeply interested here, you might want to sit up front. Listen, can you sit at the table?
Yeah, sure.
There's other seats here if anyone wants to come up close.
I'm gonna sit here unless I'll contaminate you. Good luck. Write that down.
For now. So on
Your problem. We don't have to negotiate to say how fast it takes to get somewhere, do we?
So you want to start? Okay, we're going to start on this pedestrian routes issue, and I think just to clarify how we define it, maybe be open to different ways of doing it, and Hugh would kind of raise the issue with me, but I believe it's something that will come up, particularly when we start getting more and more into retail operations going forward. And I have to say, in my situation, I wasn't there for the discussion that led to the current rules. So I think Amy was and Dick, so if you shed light on that. But I'd like to start with Erica, just kind of outlining what rules they're going by now and why, and then maybe open it up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we started with using shortest pedestrian route as a separation between protected land uses and marijuana businesses because the state uses shortest pedestrian route. So we started because we implement the state's separation requirement. So what we have in our code for areas that are not Chugiak Eagle River are distance measured by the shortest practical pedestrian route from the entrance to the proposed marijuana establishment to the closest lot line of most of the uses, or if it's a athletic field or playground, the edge of the field or playground. And I don't think we need to really get into that. So let's just use for an example one of the types of protected uses that where you go to the lot line. So we kind of have two issues. We have how do you get from the entrance to the marijuana establishment to the public right-of-way? And we struggle to figure out, if there's a pedestrian facility proposed on the lot, like if there's a sidewalk, you have to use a sidewalk. Can you go straight across the parking lot? What are the issues related to that? So that's kind of one issue. And then the second issue is once you get off of the marijuana establishment's property and you're in the public right-of-way, then where do you go? How do you measure this? So what we did is we looked at we talked to the legal department and we looked at our rules, and we decided that first it would make sense to prohibit trespassing on other people's property. Those people have not given permission for people to walk across their property, so we decided that once you get into the public right-of-way, you have to stay on public property, either in right-of-way or if there was a park or a piece of municipal property that wasn't under some other type of control, you could cross that property. So that was kind of the first decision we made. And then the second decision we made was looking at what our code says about crossing streets. And we went to Title IX for this. And Title IX has sections at 920 about pedestrian rules. And it sets up where you can cross streets based on whether you're in a business district or not in a business district. Most of these, if not all, are going to be in business districts. And I do want to point out that the Title IX definitions of business districts do not correspond necessarily to zoning districts. So they define business district in a slightly different way. But again, I couldn't swear to it, but I'm pretty sure that all of these marijuana establishments are going to be in what Title IX defines as a business district. So what Title IX says is that no pedestrian may cross a roadway other than in a crosswalk in the central business district, which is the downtown, or any business district. But if you look at what crosswalk means, basically a crosswalk exists at any intersection. It does not have to be a signalized intersection. It does not have to have painted crosswalk markings within the roadway. At any intersection, the definition of crosswalk is that there is one at any intersection. So this means that it is technically legal to cross the street at any intersection. So then you look at how we would measure the distance between the entrance of a marijuana establishment to a protected land use. And I have two examples on the board here. On the right side is how we would interpret shortest practical pedestrian route based on our current rules. So I didn't draw a building for the marijuana establishment, but say the building is approximately in the middle of the lot with the entrance at the bottom facing south, that you would come off the lot, you would be able to cross at that intersection. That would be a legal crosswalk and to the edge of the protected land use. On the left side would be an example of, so Mr. Wade has provided a lot of comment on this and suggests that one should have to go to where there is an actual painted crosswalk in the street, which you see generally at signalized intersections. So he's suggesting that shortest pedestrian route should be measured by going to the crosswalk at say, a signalized intersection such as on the left. And so we have two general concerns. One is that that would not be consistent with our laws. And two, I would ask you, in which of these scenarios are you more likely to have jaywalking? So if the concern is people dashing across the street, I think you're a lot more likely to get people dashing across the street if you create a situation where you can have marijuana establishments directly across the street from protected land uses. The other thing that I would point out is how the feds would look at a situation on the left side where you have a marijuana establishment directly across the street from a school. I don't know how we were not able to determine how the feds calculate their separation distances, but I don't think this would be something that they would like to see. So that's the perspective that we were coming from, but I know there's a lot of interest in this issue.
Interesting. Q, you have some thoughts on this?
I think we're making progress because we're talking about how to measure stuff. That's largely what this is about. It's not about actually, we're talking about roads in industrial areas and not just streets, they're roads. We're just talking about many thousands of cars. We're talking about areas where people typically don't cross. I have two locations workers that I know of that I've seen during my tenure walking across the street as myself because they don't do it. So our point is that or my point is you're starting to say, well, okay, is this about safety? Maybe. Is it about measurement? Yes. It's mostly about measurement. And the municipality's position that there's an implied crosswalk across all roads, including Tudor Road in Minnesota and Seward Highway, where there's a side street, defies logic. It is not a practical pedestrian route. In fact, you go to my location on Tudor, and you use that implied crosswalk and expect people to stop, you will get killed. It's very simple. So, I would propose that an equally defendable position is that you could say that, as my mom told me, use a light to cross the road. That's equally defendable. Not much harder to measure, less restrictive for the industry. There's a lot of implications to jobs and property values and property uses, so that's the gist of my position.
Stephanie?
So it's not just the municipal code that states this, is that we actually mimic state statute. So it's actually the state of Alaska that also asserts that every intersection is a legal location to cross. And while I agree it is not always the most practical in the sense of, well, I shouldn't say practical, because it's realistic. I mean, if you're down Tudor Road and I drive down it multiple times a day, every single day, there are pedestrians that cross successfully at places other than intersections, at intersections, and I mean outside of very many signalized intersections, because especially when it comes then to ADA accessibility, the idea that you're going to divert somebody 500 to 1,000 feet down the road to a signalized intersection to another 500, 1,000 feet, 1,000 feet back down the road. Practically, people won't do that, and we watch them not do it regularly. And the idea that vehicles are going to stop for you, I agree, is unreasonable. And in most situations, when you read, I mean, it says that pedestrians are not supposed to step off the street and create a hazard because a vehicle can stop them. And when a vehicle is traveling at 45 miles an hour, what that generally means is you have to wait for a large gap. And that's what pedestrians have to do, is they have to wait for a large gap. Most of them will cross to the median where there's refuge and then cross the other side of the street and do so. I mean, that happens all the time. Is it always desirable? Absolutely not, especially in dark situations. But it happens regularly, and I just don't think reasonably that people, and this is all very situation based. I mean, if you're in the central business district and you have a signal every 330 feet, by code, people aren't supposed to be crossing anywhere except at those signalized intersections in the central business district. But you have a signal every 330 feet. You get to Midtown and our blocks, we generally Midtown spacing of signals is anywhere from a quarter mile to half mile spacing. And that's a significant burden, not just for when you're looking at adverse conditions like this morning when I was driving in, when you have very heavy rain, and when you have very heavy snow and you have other situations. I just don't see very many pedestrians actually diverting all the way down to an intersection. And this is about the measurement, and I guess I'm kind of, I don't care one way or the other, I guess, how it's measured. I think we should have consistency in how it's measured. But when I'm looking realistically at what pedestrians are doing on a daily basis, they're doing what's in the photo and even the picture drawing on the right.
I think you're right, it's what will pedestrians do. Okay, we'll do.
Let me just interrupt real quick. Just for the recording that Assemblyman Flynn has arrived, and I got to apologize. We said we were going to start till 9:45, and we were so fast.
Efficiency is never punished.
Okay. So I appreciate that, and I think we're talking about measuring, but the ultimate goal is to have a reasonable separation from a certain group of uses. So, I guess from my point of view, where did that list of uses briefly come from that we're protected from? And then in Eagle River, we do as a crow flies, and we chose not to do that for the rest of the city. Maybe Patrick, you were here. You want to?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, stepping back from the details of what we're trying to accomplish here, getting sort of more into the philosophical public policy,
recognition that the protected uses within the state law that we're mirroring in local ordinance were sufficiently numerous that if you used a significant separation, say 1,000 feet, or dash of those lots, that you would all but eliminate any opportunity for the industry to establish itself. So we took what I would perhaps put work with a conservative approach. We stuck to the state minimums in mirroring the local code, which was 500 feet by a reasonable. And the public policy reason for that, aside from the economic argument, was also legalization of the industry allows us to drive the black market out. And if we don't provide a reasonable opportunity for the legal industry to thrive, then that opportunity is lost. So this is an outgrowth of that. I can't think of any answers to be 100% right or 100% wrong. The reason I asked Erica to invite Stephanie to the conversation was I think we can, in terms of discussing marijuana regulation, come up with a reasonable expectation of what roads can be crossed anywhere, a neighborhood road, for example, a residential street, versus an arterial, and say, for this purpose of measurement, a street that has 4 lanes or more, or is 35 miles an hour or more, or whatever a reasonable standard based on traffic engineering criteria is, that can be, I think, a reasonable application for this particular measurement. And you decide you want to apply it in other parts of the code, that's fine. But that's probably a broader discussion for a different day.
Do a comment, Ken?
So just from the industry's perspective, when we were watching these debates go in February, and I went back and I re-listened to February 9th and then re-listened to February 23rd, and Evans really summed it up nice, and I actually recorded it if anybody wants to hear it. But when we were discussing this issue, the people saw the assembly members talking about how it's not reasonable to cross 4 lanes of traffic, it's not reasonable to go across Minnesota, and so that shouldn't be counted against the marijuana industry, because we are facing so many regulations. We're willing to bend over backwards, but like bending over backwards, we can't snap our backs, and that's kind of the issue. And that's kind of what Hugh brought up, back in February when he created that great map that really illustrated the crisis we were in. So from the industry's perspective, they really relied on, hey, Minnesota, that's a major artery. That's not a reasonable jump across like a leapfrog. That's something that we can, walk and do the crosswalk measurement. And they relied on it and then invested money in it because it was used as an actual example during a public process. So I guess my issue is, it just seems kind of unfair if we're going to have a public process and we're going to participate as public citizens, and which I think is so cool that there's so many more people getting involved. We should at least be consistent with that. If we approve something with the intent of this doesn't apply to arteries that are major arteries, this isn't intended to be considered a practical route, and then we rely on it because we show up to public meetings, and that doesn't give us any benefit, what's the incentive to participating in the public process? It just seems, I don't know, it just seems a little bit unfair. That's just my perspective.
Mr. Chief, can I ask Stephanie a comment, a question?
Sure, please do.
Okay, first thing, I have a brief comment. Number one, just because one assembly member makes a comment doesn't mean every assembly member. So, but when it goes to, where you can cross, where you can't cross, Stephanie, you were talking about state law, like what leeway does the assembly have really when we're defining, basically, where people can cross and where they can't? If state law has some restrictions, how much flexibility do we have, do you know?
We can be more restrictive than state law, we cannot be less restrictive. So, I mean, if they define every intersection as a legal crossing location, within the municipality of Anchorage, we could write a code that said in certain areas along certain corridors that the only legal crossing location is a signalized intersection. We do have the ability to do so. I will tell you, I know that has been proposed in the past during Title IX rewrites, and it's not supported by APD, by the public, by a lot of people, just in the sense that it is very restrictive, and it creates a situation where you basically are making jaywalking. I mean, a lot of people keep using the term jaywalking. Jaywalking is really specific, I mean, as far as definition of what it is, and a lot of what people are saying jaywalking here is actually a legal crossing. I mean, if you are at a intersection, whether it is signalized or not, it is a legal crossing location. They are not jaywalking. So.
Okay, so maybe I'm not tracking, because what I thought I heard people saying is they want us to be less restrictive, but if in fact we're already mimicking state law, I mean, how is that possible? Am I missing something?
No, they want us to be more restrictive as far as how we're defining where pedestrians can cross, because.
So they want us to say just at signalized places, or whatever.
It sounds like it being more specific to corridors and whether we defined it by speed or lanes or classification of roadway. I mean, and see, I guess that's where I struggle with it, is because this code applies to the entire municipality of Anchorage, and every time we write a code to think of the one situation we're thinking of, there are probably 1,500 other situations we didn't consider that we now put ourselves in a really tight corner. That all of a sudden it's going to be very difficult to implement, to enforce, to monitor what we're looking at. So
I tend to agree with where you're going. I mean, I haven't been swayed yet. I think we need to change this specific portion of law just for the marijuana industry. I mean, I get the extent, but I'll sit and listen to the conversation. Thanks, Stephanie, that helps.
No problem.
Okay, let me work. Could you remind me?
Yeah, my name is Brian Duffy, and I represent Hume Wade. Yesterday, I printed off the website, the notice of this meeting, this draft memorandum. And I think this draft memorandum accurately reflects what I would refer to as how to calculate the shortest legal pedestrian route. But I think the term of art, we need to decide how to calculate the shortest practical pedestrian route, which is the term that's applicable to the marijuana industry. So I don't think anyone's advocating for you to change the law here, Kisby. What we're talking about is how to interpret this phrase, short practical pedestrian route. And I will point out that this phrase is different than shortest legal route. So there are a couple things that I think you can do, because I think your staff has some real legitimate concerns about how are we going to do this all throughout the city if we depart from what are fixed standards in the law. Maybe either the legal department or the staff who use Title IX. Title IX has to do with how you give people notice of whether or not you're going to punish them for doing a certain thing. It's not how it's certainly not how I teach my kids how to cross the street. I would never tell them to cross wherever you want on General Road. There's an intersection. I don't think anyone else would. I would never do it either. So just working off this memorandum, I think it's a good start. I would suggest 2 changes, and I don't know if this is an appropriate place to make those suggestions or not, but in terms of addressing your staff concerns, I think, we could use marked crosswalks and then insert a line the applicant's responsibility to submit with the application how this distance was calculated. And my understanding is notice would be provided to all the protected land use areas, and they could also have an opportunity to object to how that calculation was done. I've heard a number of people say all of this is going to be situational, and it is. You're not going to come up with a 2-page definition to apply to every circumstance. But there is a process in place that you can use to determine this. The applicant submits with the application a proposed calculation for how it was calculated. Notice is provided to all the protected uses, and if they have an objection or think, the neighborhood is different, then they can raise that objection, and then the planning director can make a determination. But I think with this memorandum, they're really cutting off a lot of development before you even know if there are protected uses in the neighborhood that want to be protected. I mean, there's really no point in protecting people who, don't want to be protected. I mean, he's got a property in an industrial neighborhood, and he wants to rent it to somebody to use it for an industrial purpose. And I don't really see how that's going to be any different than any other industrial use. And the same with the religious institution that may be impacted by another one of this property on Tudor Road. They may or may not have a problem with this. They may have a problem with calculation. They may have a problem with marijuana in general, or they may not. So I would suggest not making it so restricted at this point. Prefer to mark crosswalks, and then if you insert a mechanism where put the burden on the applicant. They're required to outline how this is calculated, and the people in the neighborhood can look at it and tell you if it's bogus or not. Sometimes they might, sometimes they might not. So that would be my suggestion.
Right, appreciate that. Terry?
Mr. Chairman, as the current planning manager, I just wanted to note that in virtually every case, our staff go out to investigate the sites and to take a look at the distances from protected uses. And I would note that there is no comprehensive list of protected uses. You really have to go out on site and carefully look around and see if you can identify, because they're not noted. In some cases, there have been a religious practice that may or may not actually be a religious practice, as an example. And there's just a number of factors. So the notion that injecting something like the most practical way of getting from point A to point B is always going to be subjective and open to contention, and maybe that's what we just have to live with. But we're already in a position where we spend a great deal of time and effort trying to ensure that we've got that right, and there have been a number of times already in looking at these where we're in conflict with how the applicants arrived at the same number. So I would note that for example, in a case like this, we have a number of streets. I mean, Tudor's an easy example, or Minnesota, but so does the same apply when you get to a collector level road. It really doesn't. I mean, it's relatively easy to get across at probably most any intersection. So we're placed into this subjective role of trying to make that decision of what's practical and what's not. So the more that we can give definition to this, the better our ability to enforce it is, and to establish criteria and rules that we can all live by.
All right, thank you. Kathy?
Yeah, well, I look at this more from a community public perspective than an industry perspective. So I appreciate the industry's perspective to try and incorporate how I would view it from a public perspective. Even though Turnagain Community Council does not anticipate perhaps any applications within our boundaries, we formed a committee and we followed this process closely. closely. And one of the things that we did provide comments on during the ordinance, development of the ordinance, is this particular topic and how you measure. We actually preferred and endorsed the 1,000-foot separation. Just as you had said a little bit earlier, John, I'm not sure whether it's, you want to look at it from a measurement perspective or a safety perspective, or actually the intent of a separation perspective. And I think from a public view, that intent to keep the marijuana industry establishments separated at least 500 feet from one of the protected, any of the protected, as defined by the code, properties, that's the intent. And so if we keep that goal in mind, and then try and get down into the weeds, no pun intended, on how we measure that, you know, it's tricky. It's obviously based on everybody that's commented already. It's not easy. And I think I'd agree with Terry, though, that the more defined it is, the easier it is for everybody to understand. It's easier for enforcement from the public enforcement perspective. The planning department, the assembly, to then approve these permits knowing that they adhere to something not too subjective, not too with your business, we're actually giving you a little leeway here because of where you're located, but over there we're going to be really strict with you. I'm not sure that that's, I think that could just get really dicey when you get down to it. And so from those who are going to make a decision about these things from the municipal perspective, I would hope that you would consider that the intent is to keep some of these establishments away from the protected areas. And so the, you know, what you've drawn up here, Eric, on the board is the one on the left is exactly the, one of the instances that we put in our comment letter to the planning department and the assembly is depending on how you measure 500 feet, because at that point then it was being looked at 500 versus 1,000, you can have a marijuana establishment, a retail marijuana establishment right across the street from a school. And I don't think that from a public perspective, that really is what we want in this community. And yet, depending on how you draw that little dotted line, that's exactly what this community is going to get. And I think we need to be very careful about that. So thank you.
Thanks. Let me go to Chris.
I have some.
Can I just go to Chris?
I just want to ask it to follow on this without diving into the details of this 500, 1,000 foot. I'm interested from the industry's perspective. If the model used for measurement used for range is the same methodology as Eagle River, in other words, simply as the crow flies, is that more predictable for you? I assume as a commercial realtor, you can look at a parcel map and very quickly and easily do your 100-foot or 500-foot radius know clearly which ones count and which ones don't. So is that a preferred measurement method for the industry?
So this is a real linchpin question, because it talks about what Terry's talking about. This is Kathy's talking about.
Sorry. Kathy, please.
It's easier to measure.
That's the main issue.
Hold on. So that was the whole discussion. So it was Demosky, attorney, as the crow flies. It's draw pointing. The point was we did have a public process, and the public process rejected it. It said practical. So that's what we're discussing. Practical pedestrian route is not really defined. So that's what we're doing. We're trying to define. And what Terry talked about with these prohibited uses, he's right. There's a lot of different prohibited uses, and sometimes the measurements are different for each one. And you have to kind of sift through all this stuff. You know, what you think was at the school maybe isn't because it's an adult charter school, and maybe what you think is a private gymnastics association isn't because it's actually a licensed daycare as part of their thing. So you have to really get down on the ground. But the point is, we're making progress because now we are defining it, which is going to help Terry and help the industry, and it's going to be cut and dry. Now, we've been mapping this stuff for a long time. We made some assumptions. We looked at the law and we said, well, you can't just cross the road because it says commercial district and you have to cross, you know, a reasonable person said it wasn't, and we mapped it, and then I got my client here, who's been religiously paying me rent, and he came to the same conclusion, and we thought we were good to go. This should have came out a long time ago. Then, so we, after basically a half a year of paying rent, we go and find out that we have this process where you can go on a case-by-case basis and ask Erica, and lo and behold, they said it's okay to cross Tudor Road, and that church, that lot line, they have a 5,000 square foot building, 35,000 square foot lot, way too much land. But if you can cross Tudor Road from the door of that building to that lot line, it's 400 and, I don't know, I measured it.
486 feet.
486 feet, so we're out of the block. All that money and all that time spent and all that commitment, we had to go find him another location. He's still paying rent to me now because it's preserved. So this is what should have been done a long time ago. But keep in mind, practical pedestrian route is not defined. We're totally on board with Terry. The more we can define it, it's just, we just want predictability, and that's fine. And that kind of addresses what you're saying, which is, let's get these rules in place that are fair.
You want predictability, but without risk to people crossing roads that have 39,000 cars go by today.
Is it Mr. Tobin?
I think he covered it.
Okay. All right, thanks. Stephanie?
I had a follow-up. I agree that the goal of code is to treat everybody consistently. That anybody A, B, C walks into the door, they're gonna get hopefully the same answer. I mean, really, and
Yeah.
every situation is different, every road is different, every intersection. The thing I'm gonna throw out here too is if we limit it and say marked crosswalks, you know, or signalized intersections, those are constantly changing themselves. I mean, we're constantly having road projects. I mean, so what happens? I mean, you look at Tudor Road, and if you go back a couple of years, the intersection that is now at Piper used to be at Fulford, and that signal ended up getting shifted. So crossings in that area and that business district have kind of changed. That pedestrian path has changed, and there's always ongoing discussion at DOT because Tudor Road is a state facility on whether or not additional signalized intersections are going to go into Tudor Road in specific areas to accommodate some of these concerns, because there are concerns. I'm going to step off and put on my safety hat now. Now it's more of the concerns of there are some uses along Tudor Road that encourage back and forth traffic. You have housing and a mission and some stuff on one side of the road, and then you have a liquor store and restaurants and attractive, you know, things on the other side of the street. And we know from experience they are not going to intersections to cross.
They get it.
And on occasion, yes, they do get hit. Actually, since the medians went in, and actually the medians went in and kind of restrict where people are turning, but also gave a place for pedestrians to have somewhat of a refuge, there has not been a fatality or even a major injury that I know of a pedestrian on Tudor Road since that occurred. You know, so I mean, there's changing situations that happen, you know, and the possibility of additional intersections going in. I know there's discussions on Northern Lights and Benson of possibly like putting in more signalized intersections. So you have a definition that says cross intersection, you know, marked intersections, marked crosswalks, signalized intersections. So you go in with this assumption, and within a year that you're planning or doing something, a project comes out that is now going to be a signalized intersection directly next to you. Now all of a sudden the assumption that you were based upon, you know, is completely null and void, and you now have a legal crossing that puts you right across the street from a protected use. I mean, so I get where you're coming from, because you know there's still going to be the case-by-case scenario that it's like it's not always going to be predictable, and when you come back for reviews, there may be a possibility that you may have been fined at one time and you're not fined anymore.
I think approval is a point in time. An approval is a point in time, and that has to do with the uses around you at that time and the practical pedestrian at that time. And things can change, but there seems to be a general assumption in the law that, you know, if you have an approved license and then a year later a church moved right next door, because they could move right next door, whether we objected or not. We don't have the same protections they do. They can just move right next door.
Yeah.
That you're not gonna, I would assume that.
Your grandfather can.
Yeah, you're not, so that's okay. I mean, that's just life. There's stuff changing all the time and you do it, but.
sorry, let me, Erica, real quick down there.
Well, I just wanted to keep us focused on a couple of different things. One is, the intent is to have a separation. The second is that I feel like some people think that by identifying shortest practicable pedestrian route, we're somehow saying this is the desired route, whereas as really we're saying this is the allowable route. But I really don't think we want to get into the situation on the left side where, you know, because as we know, people do cross illegally. People cross illegally on Tudor, so if they have been hit. You know, I used to drive Tudor every day when I worked in this building. Now I drive Minnesota every day, and not the south of Tudor where it's actually a highway, but you know, between Tudor and West High, Romig, people cross illegally there. I mean, it happens. So I think we need to be very careful to recognize the behavior that's there, not just what's legal or implying that we're encouraging by how we define this, or encouraging by what we actually allow on the ground.
Major artery roads, is that a defined term?
Arterial,
Arterial,
I'd say
okay.
they're within the official streets and highways plan, there's an adopted plan that defines classifications of
Okay,
roadways.
so that's something that is pretty reliable and defined, right? Would anybody have huge objections to entertaining maybe just excluding those major arterial roads and saying that's not practical, so you have to go to an actual crosswalk for that? I mean, because I think that's the issue we're getting at, is from my perspective, just the public heard, Minnesota, that's crazy, we shouldn't consider that because you would get hit. That's what I'm talking about. I don't want to get into that situation up there, because I think that the Cole memorandum, that's actually a big issue. So if it's like a little street and there's a school cross, that's not something we as the industry, at least my clients, don't want to get into that kind of situation where we're having that issue. But I mean, is it a fair compromise to say maybe the intent is these major arterial roads, that's a defined term and doesn't move a lot, you know, that is the solution here that we could work around?
I think, Mr. Flynn, you had some thoughts on that.
Well, that is why, again, I thought Stephanie contributed to this conversation. You know, the HASDA, that's the right acronym, National, or ASHTO, thank you, Francis. Has definitions of where it's appropriate for pedestrians to cross and where it's not. We don't have to adopt that as our code universally through mechanism code, but it might be a useful guideline for this particular definition. Where do we practically want people to be crossing? And I think that would provide some clarity, and it's defensible as a reasoned approach. So that was my thinking.
And if we wanted to draw a line, if you're looking, at classifications of roads, see, there's two different classifications of arterials. There's both minor and major. And I'd probably say that major would actually be the line where you want to have it. I mean, because a minor arterial can be, or a minor arterial, Spinard Road is a minor arterial. You know, which depending on where you are, when we reconstruct the section of Spinard Road that we're going to be reconstructing, it's going to be a 3-lane section. There's going to be, median refuges, and it's going to be 1 lane each direction. So, crossing in those situations, and, the other section of Spinard that is from International Airport Road to Northwood is also a 3-lane section. There are some sections that are 4-lane sections. Question comes down, I'm sitting here going in my head, whether we're saying 4-lane roadway, whether you say anything greater than 4-lane roadway, or whether you say 4-lane divided. So it's like, I don't know whether lanes is appropriate or whether, classification. I'd probably go with classification more than I'd go with lanes. Because lanes do change. Classifications do change, but 2005 was the previous version of OSNHP, and then it was updated in 2014.
Changes tend to be at the collector level a lot more frequently than the arterial level.
Exactly. And so when you're looking at you have major arterials, which are usually gonna be a minimum of 4 lanes, and you're talking, 4 lanes, you're talking 20 to 30,000 vehicles minimum. Then above that, you have expressways, and then you have highways. Your expressway is International Airport Road, and then you have your highways, which is obviously Glen, Seward, and then a portion of Minnesota south of Tudor Road that is very separated, interchangeable, you're not supposed to be interchangeable, that sort of thing. But most of the roadways we're sitting here discussing that you're looking at, Tudor Road, major arterial. Minnesota from Tudor north, major arterial. Northern Lights, Benson, major arterials. Lake Otis is actually a minor arterial. So that one is like, looking at Lake Otis, that is a minor arterial. But that is something that is easily defined. I mean, and there's a document that has been adopted by the Assembly that clearly has, something in guidance that I think would be predictable and consistent. So when we're looking at that as far as using, and I mirror what Erica says though, in the sense that, when we're drawing that on the map and saying that it's, a practical route for pedestrians, we're not saying it's a desirable route.
It's safer.
Do you have a comment?
It's interesting, this whole restrictive, less restrictive. Clearly what we're proposing is crosswalks is more restrictive from a safety point, which is more in line with state law. And, I lost my train of thought. Here it is, the whole arterial, it's like, what about collectors? I mean, to me, if you just say that people have to walk in crosswalks, and this is how we're gonna measure it, not just on major arterials, but on collectors, let's face it, some of the most dangerous roads, Potter used to be dangerous because used to connect to Dowling, and there's no place to walk on the side of the road, and it's very narrow, and people got hit. So, I mean, why would you just limit it to major arterials? To me, if it's a business district, it's generally safest to cross at crosswalks, and these are all in business districts. If it's anything short of a residential area, you should probably cross at a crosswalk. It's safer. They're not doing it. But do we want to enshrine that we don't want them to do it? We want them to actually, we don't. It doesn't make sense. It's all about trying to protect these protected uses, but in the meantime, the industry, you're just putting this undue burden that no other business has to go through, and you're really not protecting anybody.
But I do think it's important to protect the industry in terms of we cannot have marijuana establishments across from a school.
Any owner, any property owner is gonna make their own assessment as to their risk tolerance level, and any tenant is also gonna make an equal. And
But
that's
it's
really
not just a risk to that individual business, it's a risk to the actual industry.
Okay, so
I've been listening to this gentleman speak for quite a few minutes. I don't know who I'm listening to.
I'm Hugh. Wade, nice to meet you.
Okay. And Hugh, can you tell me who you are?
Yeah,
Or if you represent anybody?
I'm representing myself. I'm a commercial real estate broker who has some properties that, depending on how practical pedestrian route is defined, may or may not have cannabis operators in them.
Okay, it just helps give me context. I wasn't sure I was listening to. Thank you.
Okay, we've had a good discussion here, Dick. Amy, anything to add on this?
Well, my ask is that this is common for us, and I have some homework to do. So I would just ask that, this is brought back to another meeting for further discussion. I'd like to sit down and look at some of the historical documents that Stephanie referenced and have some further discussions and see if I can get my mind wrapped around both sides of it so I accurately have them in my mind. So I'm not prepared at this point personally to either support or reject the notion. I'm going to
Okay, sounds prudent. Any thoughts on that, Dick?
I think we do need to postpone this and get a full body to discuss this on the assembly.
So we've had a good discussion, got some highlights, and then go to a work session and look at, and the goal would be to define practical route as opposed to legal route. We've had some
is to get an AIM that the assembly will support with, and then we would take whatever the assembly approves in the AIM and condense it into a definition to adopt into the code.
And you would do that? Prepare it? Who would prepare it?
Well, I mean, I prepared this, and if this is not, what, you know, I prepared this for Mr. Flynn. Mr. Flynn said, not really, that's not quite what I want. So, I took his name off of it and left it blank.
Some remember no name, huh?
Yes. So, I'm happy to help revise it at the direction of the committee, if the committee would like to take this on as something the committee wants to bring to the full assembly.
As I referenced a couple of times, Mr. Chairman, my reason for drawing Stephanie into this conversation is I thought we could come up with a reasonable line of demarcation. I think major arterial is worthy of further discussion. As saying, we're going to require you to crosswalk for this definition along major arterials. Others will let it go under the current standard. Because, you know, if you're walking along Wisconsin, you want to cross over to Baltimore Central Park, you're not going to go down to Arrow, you're just going to cross, right? So let's be fair here about what's reasonable. And I think that's a good line to work from. And the body may decide they have a better idea, but I think that's a good start.
Okay, and just to clarify, sorry, so Erica would add to part of that definition that major arterials would not be, crossing major arterials would not be
Would require you to
reasonable.
Why not Wisconsin too? You're not.
I
it's
can
still gonna
amend
walk
this
across.
as the committee, if you think the committee wants to submit the AIM, I will make this to be what, I will change it to have it say what the committee wants it to say.
I think it'd be good to add that, because then in the discussion as a group, it's easier to cross something out than to do. So you can kind of add that to the definition. It sounds like we're roughly in that realm here. I think that's what it is. So I think
I want to see the document.
Right.
Get a document first so we can have something to work on.
Right, okay.
I was thinking about some of these. Wisconsin is a residential collector. It's primarily residential. There are some other uses. The idea, and you have signals at both ends that are at arterial. So you've got Northern Lights, you have Spenard, and you have 35th. To consider the fact that, once again, we're looking at these definitions and you're talking safe, not safe, things like that. I think it's both unreasonable, kind of ridiculous to say that it's unsafe to cross that road other than at those
But
signalized
I said it in the
intersections.
beginning, I'll say it again,
Yeah.
it's strictly about measurement, people are still gonna walk across, there's no real reason to enshrine people to walk across Wisconsin, and people definitely aren't gonna get arrested for it. But for an industry that already has enough things to deal with, you just said they have to walk in crosswalks, including Wisconsin, it would really help the industry.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Sure.
I know sometimes when we have issues like cell towers and whatnot, we sometimes will have one or two members kind of spearhead the effort on this. I know Mr. Bliss is not necessarily a member of our committee, but if anybody can, hammer this out, this is probably myself and Mr. Bliss. I'm happy to, if we need this training, I'm happy to kind of get together and kind of help us through, because I think they're probably, from what I'm hearing, I think there's probably a reasonable resolution. I'm happy to help if you want to go that route.
Always glad to have your help, thank you. So you're gonna work with Mr. Flynn and Erica and get some.
You got drafted, didn't I?
Yeah, if you feel like to, I would be happy to, I'd be happy to do it. I think between the two of us, we were able to hash out the distance the first time, and it may have seemed painful to some, but we were able to get a resolution that fit the needs of both our communities, and I think we can work with this one.
Okay, yeah, he's anxiously volunteering.
Yeah. Always a pleasure.
What kind of time frame?
I could probably do it this week or next week.
That'd be good. So should we schedule a meeting in this committee, or should we bring it to a work session?
Well, I think we should come back to the committee first.
Get a document.
Because I think this is where we're going to have the most productive dialogue, honestly, before we inject,
Okay. Okay, we'll look at the schedule. I think we're getting, when the marijuana applicants come through, it's been pretty quick. We may have some retail that might be a little bit longer, but it's really for the retail stores, we want to have this thing tightened up, so.
Okay, well, I'll make sure I send the meeting over to Paul Patrick and get with him and get with Eric and stuff.
Okay, good, thank you. Okay, anything else on this then? I think we have a plan for you. Thanks for coming, everybody.